Please be seated. Mr. West, you may proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Do you have this chart in front of you?
I do.
Okay, so if we refer to that, you've got a reference?
Yes, I have my reports as well.
When you say reports, you're talking about the summary findings?
The 3 reports I issued with all the results
Right.
that are in this chart.
Okay, and do you have your notes with you if need be?
Yes.
Great, okay.
203 down green, which one is it? That's 203.
The chart, thank you. The chart is exhibit number 203. Is that what yours says?
Yes, it has a 203 on it.
Okay. What I'd like to try to do is sort of track through the evidence a lot in the same order that was just done, so sort of keep that sequence and that frame of reference.
Okay.
But before, let's talk a little bit, Joe, generally about the DNA work that you do. It sounds like a lot of the analysis that you did was based upon evidence collection that someone else did. For example, swabs from other items.
That's correct.
So you would have played no part in collecting whatever evidence may exist from that flashlight, for example.
Correct. I don't actually go to scenes and collect evidence. I've actually never been to a scene and collected evidence. I first see the evidence when it comes in to the laboratory and brought to me in a sealed envelope or a sealed paper bag, and I take it from there. Sometimes it's a swab that someone else collects. Sometimes, as in the jacket and sweatshirt, sometimes it's the actual item.
But it's always gone through someone else's hands first.
Yes, that's correct.
And in this instance, there were swabs of the firearm of 4 different sections of the firearm.
Yes.
So you don't make any determination, then I take it, where DNA should be and isn't, for example. You just report what you find.
Correct. In that instance, I just test those 4 swabs and report my results from those 4 swabs.
For example, it's not in dispute that George Zimmerman fired the gun, but there was no DNA on the trigger. You don't try to figure out why that might be.
That's correct. I just report out that I was not able to obtain any DNA results from that swab from the trigger.
Sometimes you can touch an object and there not be any DNA left behind.
That's correct.
Sometimes if there might even be blood, it could be wiped off.
Yes, that's correct as well. Items can be washed and cleaned, wiped, washed, and that could affect my ability to get any DNA from touch evidence or blood evidence on an item.
That might include environmental factors, whether or not it's raining, for example.
Yes, moisture, heat, humidity, all those environmental factors can degrade DNA, meaning it chops the DNA up into pieces. The DNA is a long chain with letters, and those letters, segments of those chains, those are those 13 loci that I test. So if those segments are degraded, those short segments are degraded and in pieces, that affects my ability to amplify and make copies of those short segments and be able to see any results that I can make any kind of comparisons with.
You're suggesting that humidity, specifically rain, can do that?
Moisture, which involves humidity and rain.
And of course, it's possible, I suppose, on a gun, for example, that because it's a hard surface, it could just be wiped off because someone handled it.
That's correct, yes. A gun is a hard surface, so any touch DNA or skin cells is going to be on that hard surface. There's no medium for any skin cells to soak into it. As, for example, in a shirt, sometimes if I'm trying to determine who's wearing a shirt and I'm trying to get skin cells from like the inside of the collar or the armpits that come in contact with that individual, that shirt could soak in those skin cells. on a hard surface like a gun or a knife or a pen. I'm trying to get what's on that surface. It's a hard surface, and it's not good for collecting and retaining touch DNA.
So, for example, on 21C, the pistol slide that we talked about a minute ago, your conclusion was that there were limited DNA results, and you were not able to make a determination regarding Mr. Zimmerman or Mr. Martin.
Yes, 21C from the slide. That's correct.
Which means that there was some DNA that you could identify through analysis.
Correct. There was some information present from my testing of that item. It was not enough information for me to be able to match it to any one individual. I can't tell if it's a mixture or single source because a lot of that information that I need is missing. But there was enough information for that specific sample for me to make comparisons and make an exclusion potentially. And I wasn't able to exclude either of the two individuals.
So what that means, bottom line, is that in some situations you have limited DNA, but you have enough to say it could not have come from someone.
Correct.
Whereas in this case you had a limited amount, but indeed the DNA could have come from either George Zimmerman or Trayvon Martin.
I wasn't able to exclude them, so I can't say that there's no way that they could have contributed to that very limited sample.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the slide of the gun is also a hard surface that would be subject to not only the same environmental effects that you talked about, but perhaps handling, the way the evidence was packaged or secured even.
Correct.
Similarly, with regard to the holster, you did indicate that you were able to identify a profile that matched Mr. Zimmerman.
Correct. There was
I'm sorry, so you're confident then that Mr. Zimmerman's DNA is on the holster?
the major DNA profile from the holster matched George Zimmerman.
And you wouldn't know from what part of the holster, for example?
No, I don't know where on the holster they swabbed. It was represented as coming from the holster, so I don't know if that means the entire holster, the inside, outside, or what. Just
somewhere on that greater surface, there must have been some of George Zimmerman's DNA somewhere.
Yes, the profile, the major profile matched George Zimmerman.
And then insofar as the holster from Trayvon Martin, you had limited information on a minor contributor?
Yes.
And you were not able to exclude or specifically include Trayvon Martin as a contributor to that DNA?
That's correct.
When you say exclude, you mean could not possibly have been in your world. In the scientific world of DNA statistics, when you exclude somebody, you're saying with those kinds of numbers, it really couldn't have been that person.
No, I'm saying there's enough of an absence of their information that they could not have been part of that data. That data that I'm seeing, that mixture of DNA, if I exclude someone, I'm saying they could not, I don't think they contributed to that data. Does that mean they never touched or came in contact or have seen that item? I don't know. I know from what I tested on that swab and my results, if I exclude someone, I'm saying I don't think that they are possibly part of that data that I obtained from that swab.
And when you say you've excluded them, it's based upon that probability statistical model that you talked about?
Not necessarily.
No?
I'm saying I don't feel that their information is not represented enough that I feel there's no way that they could have contributed to that data. I performed the statistics for the inclusions and matches to show relevance for a match or an inclusion, but an exclusion is just, I don't feel that that person could have contributed, and that's the end of it.
Not enough data. Well, of the data that you have, it simply doesn't match in any meaningful way the person that you've excluded.
Exactly. The data present does not enough of that person's profile is present in that unknown sample for me to say they could have possibly contributed to it. Does
the ability to conduct reliable, meaningful DNA analysis sometimes also depend on the way the evidence is collected and packaged.
Yes.
So, for example, if the collection was just not a good job, there could be DNA that was missed, and you wouldn't know that.
Potentially, if an item is collected and not stored properly or packaged properly, it could be exposed to those environmental factors that I discussed earlier, like heat, humidity, bacteria, microorganisms. All of those can degrade DNA on a sample, on a gun or a knife or whatever sample we're talking about. And once that damage is done, once that DNA is degraded and in pieces, that's going to affect my ability to see results when I look at that DNA profile.
It's very difficult for you to be able to figure out how much damage was done. It's hard to know what you don't know, in other words.
Correct. The first I see of the evidence is when it's brought to me in the laboratory, the package. I don't know when that was collected, how it was stored, how long it was sitting in an office or wherever before it was submitted to our laboratory.
I think the next item that you talked about were swabs that were collected. I'm sorry, these little Exhibit 169 are the swabs from the flashlight that had no DNA results, correct? And also the swab from the bag of Skittles candy?
Correct.
And similarly, you received the swabs, someone else swabbed the item itself and gave this to you, and you did your analysis.
Yes, I never saw the bag, the Skittles bag or the flashlight.
Now we have Exhibit 191. Those are the little wooden sticks that you talked about that in your training and experience are used for fingernail scrapings.
Yes.
And what your understanding of the procedure is that the small stick is scraped under the edge of the fingernail to see if whatever's under the fingernail that might have some biological component is gathered on the stick and then submitted to you.
That's correct.
So I take it could be blood, but it could be other stuff too?
Well, if I see red-brown staining on the item, I do test it for the possible presence of blood, which I did with the right hand, the stick collected from the right hand, and that gave me a positive result.
Yes.
So,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. You actually saw something on the stick that made you think it could be blood?
yes.
And then you did the presumptive?
Yes.
And then you got a positive, so you did the DNA?
Yes.
And you indeed were able to confirm that that was Trayvon Martin's blood?
Yes, the profile matched him, which means nothing foreign. I did not find anything foreign to him on that stick.
And then on the left, I don't want to confuse them. Which one was negative?
The left hand, I did not test for blood. There was no staining on the stick collected from the left hand, and I was not able to obtain any DNA results from my testing on that stick.
So even though you didn't see what in your mind might be blood, you tested it anyway?
Yeah, well, I'm not necessarily looking for blood. A lot of times when fingernails or fingernail scrapings are collected, there's going to be blood present. A lot of times that person is bleeding, touching that area that they're bleeding from, and their own blood a lot of times is going to be present. I'm more interested in anything foreign to the person whose fingernails they are, so I'm more interested in any maybe skin from the other person or other people involved in the incident that might have scraped off underneath the fingernails of that individual. It could be blood from that other individual. If there was a fight and that other person was bleeding, there could be blood from both people. underneath the fingernails. But I'm more interested in anything foreign to the blood from that person.
Insofar as the blood on the right hand from Trayvon Martin, you would have no idea when that blood may have come in contact with his fingernail,
That's correct.
whether it was during whatever incident took place or after if he touched his own clothing that had blood,
That's correct.
or transferred from during the process of the livery service, for example. In other words, you just don't know.
That's correct. I just know whatever was on that stick when I swabbed it, that's when those are the results. I don't know when whatever DNA got underneath those fingernails. I don't know when that happened.
And on the left hand, there was no DNA of anyone, not even Trayvon Martin.
That's correct.
Did that surprise you?
No.
Because there just wasn't? Is that what it boils down to?
I mean, it's a very small stick, and you're scraping underneath fingernails. I can expect to see the DNA from that person whose fingers they are. However, it's not a guarantee that I'm going to get DNA from them. Most of the time, you see at least some kind of DNA profile from that individual, but it doesn't surprise me if I get no DNA results. It's a very small stick that I'm swabbing in a very small area that they're trying to collect DNA from.
That's something that you've seen before, where there just hasn't been any DNA on the fingernail scraping stick.
That's correct.
So in other words, the absence of evidence isn't particularly significant to you in that instance.
No.
Have you, I take it that you were not present when that process was done.
I was not.
So you didn't see anyone do any scraping, and I take it you never saw Trayvon Martin's fingernails.
No.
You don't know if they were long or short or whether there was anything at all visible.
No, I have no idea.
There is something curious here, though, that I wanted to ask you about. There's only one each, one for left and one for right. Do you think in evidence collection that all 5 fingers on each hand would have been scraped with the same stick?
Yes, generally speaking, that one stick would be used to scrape all 5 fingernails from that hand.
So you would take the stick and you would pull it underneath one fingernail, and then you would take the same thing and pull it under the other, and then likewise for each hand?
I've never done that process. I've never worked in the capacity where I'd be collecting that type of evidence, but I would imagine that that's how they would be doing it. But again, I would just be guessing because I've never done that.
Oh, I'm sorry. So you sort of just, in your mind, common sense would tell you that one stick would be used for all 5?
Yes.
As opposed to maybe only one fingernail was scraped on each hand?
I mean, that's certainly a possibility. However, they represented that from being the left hand. So in my mind, they scraped all 5 fingernails from that left hand and from that right hand with those 2 sticks.
If this matters to you, on the packaging it says fingernail left and fingernail right, as opposed to fingernails. Does that mean anything to you?
No.
You didn't participate at all in the collection of this, as you said. Well, we can talk to the people that did.
Yes, that's how they chose to label and type it out and put that label on there.
I noticed, though, just curiously, that each part of the gun was swabbed separately. Remember that?
Yes.
So there's a swab that relates to a slide, a separate one for the grip, a separate one for the trigger, and then a separate one for the holster.
Yes.
So that would tell you where, at least from what part, more precisely, any DNA was located.
Yes.
So, for example, on that that right hand, I guess, where Trayvon Martin's blood was, you would have no idea under which nail or where that was actually collected.
That's correct. Somewhere on the right hand, that blood was present, at least under one of those fingernails.
According to the packaging.
Yes.
All right, let's talk about the hooded sweatshirt for a moment. I believe that's Exhibit 155. That's represented in Exhibit 118 in the picture. Let's talk about the packaging of this particular item, or in fact, well, first, did you do any processing for DNA of any sort on Trayvon Martin's pants?
No.
Never saw those.
No.
So your DNA analysis was based upon two articles of clothing, the hooded sweatshirt and then the underneath shirt?
As far as what Trayvon Martin was wearing?
Yes.
Yes.
Mhm. So as far as those particular items, you talked a little bit about packaging. Packaging that can, by virtue of how it's packaged, cause degradation of biological samples.
It could potentially, yes.
You're familiar with NIST? Do you know the acronym NIST?
National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Right. That's an organization that helps standardize such things as evidence collection techniques and such.
Yes, NIST is a government organization that issues standards. We actually have the standards for like calibration and stuff like that as a reference to make sure that your instrumentation works. We actually have NIST standards in our laboratory that we're required to run annually, and sometimes more than that, depending on if we get a new instrument or any new chemistry, to make sure that we're obtaining the right results from these standards.
And is NIST part of the accreditation process for the lab?
No.
Then you mentioned that the lab is accredited.
Yes.
But that's a different set of standards than the NIST standards that you were talking about?
That's correct.
Explain that just a bit.
We are accredited by ASCLD Lab. That stands for the American Society of Crime Lab Directors Laboratory Accreditation Board, and it's an organization made up of forensic laboratory directors from all over the country, and they come out and they do a thorough inspection of your facilities, your standard operating procedures, your case files. They interview your personnel, and they make sure that you meet the FBI's quality assurance standards in order to maintain or get accreditation. That inspection takes place every 5 years. We had one in 2010, just 3 years ago now. And in between those 5-year inspections, we're required to maintain accreditation. We're required to undergo an internal audit every year and an external audit every other year.
And in addition to that, for the lab, you also yourself have to undergo regular proficiency testing?
Yes, that's part of the accreditation process that every analyst or forensic technologist that wants to be proficient in DNA testing needs to undergo those proficiency tests that I discussed at the very beginning of my testimony. Tests from outside companies that I run. It's a set of samples that I run as if it were a case, and I send the results out, and then they send a notice back saying I passed or I didn't pass, and that I do every 6 months. Everyone in the lab is required to do that every 6 months.
Sounds like at least then 10 times each 5-year cycle that you yourself have to go through proficiency testing.
Yes.
When we're talking about standards and we're talking about biological evidence in particular. Is biological evidence sort of a broad term for what may contain blood, fluids, DNA, and that sort of thing?
Yes, it is. I work in the biology section, so we don't call it the DNA section, we're the biology section. It encompassed not just DNA. At one point, back before DNA testing, there was other testing done on, it's called biological fluid.
And it's well known that handling and packaging wet evidence that may have biological evidence on it is how it should be done. I didn't say that at all.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, it's well known in the process of collecting and preserving biological evidence how you should handle wet evidence.
Correct.
In fact, wet evidence that's believed to contain biological material is supposed to be air dried.
Yes, anything wet that might have blood or any kind of biological material on it should be dried down, because if it remains wet, that moisture, if you package it, that could get trapped in, and you could develop microorganisms, bacteria, mold, whatever, and all of those things degrade the DNA that might be there.
In fact, it's recognized that there's a high probability that biological material will be destroyed by bacterial growth, which could potentially preclude the generation of DNA results if wet material isn't air dried.
That's correct.
So that brings us to the sweatshirts. Were you present at the time they were received by FDLE or soon thereafter?
The first time I saw the sweatshirt, it was when the package was brought to myself.
Had it been opened already?
Yes.
Who opened it?
Alvin Guzman, who is an analyst or forensic technologist in the trace evidence section, had already opened that package and done his examination, and then sealed that back in the package, and I got a transfer from him.
Trace evidence is another section of your lab?
Yes.
Just generally, that's where the evidence might be inspected for stuff. Whatever little stuff might be clinging to it, it would be collected and packaged and then perhaps submitted to someone else to analyze?
Yes. Trace evidence looks at like small fibers and stuff like that.
And when you got the evidence of the two shirts, were they repackaged and sealed in the same packaging that they were submitted to the lab?
Yes.
And what was that, please?
The outer container was a... May I refer to my notes?
Of course.
Okay. Both sweatshirts, the light gray one and the dark gray one, they were both packaged. The outer container was a sealed brown paper bag, and then inside that sealed brown paper bag was a red, what I call a biohazard bag. It's a red plastic bag that's usually used for putting biohazardous material in. And that biohazard bag was not sealed with tape necessarily, but it was knotted, sealed with a knot. And then inside that red bag was the sweatshirt, both sweatshirts, individually in separate packages, not in the same package.
It's common for you to receive evidence in brown paper bags, correct?
Yes, brown paper bags is ideal for packaging items because the paper bag lets the item breathe, so if there's any moisture in there, it'll dry out.
Unfortunately, in this situation, while the exterior packaging was brown paper, the interior packaging was plastic.
Yes, it was a red biohazard plastic bag.
And even though you didn't see it when Mr. Guzman opened it, you're saying that he tied it back up before he gave it to you?
Yes.
And then when you opened it to begin your inspection, you detected quite an odor of mold or ammonia,
Yes.
correct? It struck you that it smelled bad.
On one of the sweatshirts, the dark gray hooded sweatshirt. The light gray sweatshirt did not have the same odor.
And that meant to you that it maybe wasn't as wet?
Correct.
I take it your assumption, your professional assumption was this smell is associated with evidence that has been packaged wet and then stored for a period of time.
Correct. The items, both sweatshirts were still wet when I opened the package. The light gray non-hooded sweatshirt was damp, a little damp. It wasn't really that wet. The dark gray hooded sweatshirt was more damp. It was wet, and it had a very pungent odor. Ammonia, mold, I'm not exactly sure what the odor was, but something along those lines. I noted in my notes.
Did you ever find your gym bag in the trunk after a couple of weeks? That kind of odor? You know what I'm talking about? Kind of a strong ammonia, mold, this dirty laundry that's been sitting around a while?
I've had sports equipment that have smelled like that before, yes.
What should have been done, if I hear what you're saying, is that the clothing should have been air dried before it was packaged, or at least packaged in paper bags.
That's correct. Ideally, yes, you'd like to air dry anything you collect, especially items of clothing that are wet. You'd like to air dry them before you package them. And on top of that, we encourage our agencies not to put things into plastic bags because those don't allow the evidence to breathe, and that'll trap in any kind of moisture.
And that would be a red flag to you as an analyst that there's something going on with this evidence that places the biological evidence at a risk of degradation.
Correct.
The things that you were talking about before, how the strands break up and such?
Yes, that's correct.
And I take it would be impossible for you to be able to quantify precisely how much degradation there was.
And that's correct. I mean, you can tell by the testing you do, maybe you expect more results than you got, and you can say, oh, there was probably some degradation. However, I mean, that's a hypothetical situation. If the evidence were allowed to dry down and package properly, would I have gotten more results? Potentially, but I don't know for sure, and that's a hypothetical.
That's an unknown factor in this case.
Correct.
You don't know what you don't know.
Exactly.
So, did you dry the evidence at that point?
I left it out to dry as long as I could. However, I needed to transfer that item to a firearms examiner, Amy Seward. So I can't, when we transfer from one section to another section, I just can't take the sweatshirt and hand it to her, say, here you go. That needs to be put back into the original packaging for the transfer. So I did package that back up, and it was still wet when I packaged it back up. But that transfer from Alvin Guzman to myself to Amy Seward took place in a matter of hours, not days or weeks.
Had you taken your cuttings and finished your photography and done your swabbing before you passed it on to Ms. Seward?
Correct. I took everything I needed. I did all of my analysis because I knew that was going to be transferred on. And once another section gets a hold of that and they're testing it for latent fingerprints or firearms exams or whatever they're doing to it, that could potentially affect my ability to get results. There's always an order at which the evidence goes from section to section.
So the way the sequence went in the lab, Mr. Guzman started with the trace.
Correct.
And he wouldn't apply chemicals for that sort of thing.
No.
It's more of a visual inspection and then collection of fibers and such.
It's called sweeping, what he does, and I've never done it. I'm not trained in how to do it, but I have observed him doing it, and he's basically brushing the item to collect any kind of trace evidence, any kind of fibers or small strings or outside grass debris, whatever was on that sweatshirt, and packaging that into a small paper fold for any future examinations or testing.
And then it goes to you, and you don't do any chemical application to the fabric itself, or do you?
No. I perform that chemical test for the possible presence of blood. I rub a piece of filter paper and then test the filter paper. And if that's negative, I take a small cutting from the stain and I test directly on the fabric from that small cutting. I never actually drop any kind of chemicals onto the actual garment itself.
So you do a very careful inspection, no doubt, but it's to look for something that may be blood in your mind, or some
Correct.
biological evidence of some sort.
Correct.
And when you see it, you then use the filter paper, and then you may test the filter paper.
For the blood test, yes.
And that would give you the presumptive test that, hey, this is blood.
It gives me positive or negative result for the possible presence of blood.
If you get the negative, I think, as you've talked about on some of these items, you're satisfied that it's not blood, so you don't do any more testing typically.
It depends on the scenario and the item, but if I'm looking for blood stains on an item and something tests negative, then I'm not going to go on and do DNA testing on that stain.
And there are a number of items or number of spots or stains where when you got a negative with the rubbing, that was the end of your analysis as far as that spot was concerned.
Correct.
And then when you get a positive, you know it's positive for blood, but that then, in the sequence, you'll then do the DNA analysis on that spot. Do you go back and swab the spot, or do you test the filter paper?
No, I take a small cutting. I take a scalpel and I cut out a portion of that stain. As we were looking at the items down below before, you saw little squares missing from those stains. Those are the portions I cut out and put into a tube in order to do my testing.
I think I heard you say that the size of the cutting is somewhat proportional to how much surface area you think you need to get a good result.
Yes, in order to get a complete DNA profile, what I think I need.
So it starts with the visual, goes to the rubbing, and then to the cutting. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then when you do the cutting is when the DNA part comes in. That's what's processed for DNA.
Yes.
Can you describe briefly what that is? What do you do at the point that you've got these cuttings?
What do you mean, what
do you do with them?
I store them until I'm ready to start the first step, which would be the extraction process.
How does that work?
I'm applying heat and chemicals to the cutting in that tube in order to break open all the cells that are in there and expose the DNA molecule. And then I'm trying to wash away all that cellular debris and everything that's in there besides the DNA. I'm trying to get nice isolated DNA from that stain.
I know this sounds silly, but you can't see any of this, right? We're talking truly DNA.
No, I can't see DNA, but I can see a tube and I can see the chemicals in the tube. It's a small tube with a little bit of usually clear liquid. Various different chemicals are used.
And then when you go through your process, you at the other end get results. And then you're able to interpret those results as to whether you believe it's from a certain individual, maybe a number of individuals, and then whether or not you can make some sort of opinion as to who it's from.
Yes.
And that would be the process that you would have used for all of the samples for which you did DNA analysis.
Yes.
So on the hooded sweatshirt, could we concentrate on your findings there just for a moment?
Yes.
Stain. I suppose we should look at the shirt itself if we could for a moment. Would you be able to correlate the stain that's marked on the shirt and just say what you found as to each of those stains where you were able to make a finding?
Yes.
Well, let's do that then, if we could get some help. Let's start with the hooded sweatshirt.